So today is going to be a little bit of a different video today because I am, instead of doing makeup, I'm going to be talking about it. Prepare yourself, because today I'm going to be talking about the Subculture palette. So I have both of these palettes, which were purchased myself. I am a nobody in the YouTube community, and I was not given either of these products to me via a PR package. I am not being paid to share any of my views on this product. I am also not associated in any way with Anastasia Beverly Hills. Although, girl, if you want to holler at me for some PR, then go nuts, but I am not associated with this brand whatsoever, so my opinion is entirely my own and unbiased. I initially was going to hold back and I wasn't going to touch this. I was not going to touch this issue. But I figured, since I don't have that many subscribers and I've done so much research on this already and I've watched so many different videos, I figured I might as well just kind of, comment. Okay, so the first thing that I want to comment on is the softness. Now, I've watched a whole bunch of people's interpretations. I've seen tons of people taking their brushes and swirling and swirling and swirling, and their eyeshadows completely explode. Does this palette have a lot of kick up? Yes, it does. Is this product cheap? No, it is not, and I will explain why. So this is the Subculture palette right here, and I'm going to take the little brush out. We'll deal with that later. So this is what the palette looks like. We've got a whole bunch of really nice colors here. Personally, I would have arranged the palette a little bit differently in terms of color coherence, but you've got some warm colors in through here. You've also got the cooler colors throughout the back. So the palette itself is divided into these kind of super sparkly, thick kind of duochrome colors. We've got Cube, we've got Electric, and we've got Adorn. And then we have ultra matte shades, which are Roxy, Dawn, Destiny, Fudge, New Wave, Untamed, All-Star, Mercury, Edge, Axis, and Rowdy. Now, if you look at the palette, I like to kind of divide the palette into quads, so into fours. You've got a nice cool section here. You've got kind of a mid-tone-ish warm with this Untamed thrown in there. You've got a really nice golden green. You've also got a really nice kind of, I associate this more with camouflage kind of colors. And then you've got, your lighter colors, your duochromes and whatnot. So would I have arranged the palette a little bit better? Yes, personally. But again, I can see why this was arranged the way it was. It is very cohesive. In terms of shades that have already existed, Fudge is the only kind of oldish shade. Now the Fudge in this palette versus the individual shadow is a little bit different. So I want to just quickly compare the two eyeshadow palettes just at first glance. So I'm going to hold them up like this. So you can see this is the Modern Renaissance palette and this is the Subculture palette. If you look at the different color combinations, you look at the overall tone of the palette, this palette is very cohesive. It is a warm, reddish toned palette. This palette is primarily cool toned, but it does have some complementary color combinations. For example, All Star is a very reddish brown, whereas the color underneath, Untamed, is a green. Which brings me to my first point. People are saying that their eyeshadows are turning gray. Now, if you think about basic color theory, if you imagine a color wheel, you can imagine that you've got colors that are analogous, meaning that they are beside each other on the color wheel, and you have colors that are complementary, which means that they are opposite on the color wheel. Now, I used to be really into art, and I used to paint a lot and what have you, and in order to make the color black or the color gray is essentially a shade of black, what you would do is you would take two complementary colors on the color wheel, mix equal parts of them, and that will give you black. So, you can't go into a whole bunch of different shades in this Subculture palette and create a cohesive look, because if you, say for example, if you mixed All Star and Untamed, it turns gray because they're complementary colors. So basically what they do is they neutralize, they meet in the middle, and they create in this case, a nasty ass shade of gray that nobody's gonna like because it's not cute, because that's just basic color theory and that's the way it works. So that addresses that one issue of the grayness. There's a pigment to filler ratio, and this is the reason why I have Modern Renaissance here with me, as well as the Subculture palette. If you have the back of your Modern Renaissance palette here with you, if you look at the actual colors, you will notice that the first two ingredients are mica and dimethicone. Mica is the basis to most pigments. It kind of falls under two categories. There's mica and there's talc. Talc is, yes, cheaper, but talc also has its benefits. Mica is more expensive because mica is, I'm trying to describe, I make skincare, so I know what these feel like. I make things. Mica is softer. Mica has a shimmer to it. It doesn't feel as dry. It has more glide. Talc, on the other hand, is more, I want to say more of like a porous kind of firm powder. I'm not explaining myself very well, but if you think of baby powder is technically cornstarch. It's not talc anymore because talc is known to have asbestos contamination done to it, which is another point. But these colors in the Modern Renaissance palette are mica and dimethicone. Dimethicone is a very important ingredient that a lot of people have not touched on. Dimethicone is a type of a silicone. So silica, is essentially sand that's been ground up, and it creates this very soft, smooth texture. Think of velvet. The Makeup Forever Ultra HD powder, that is pure 100% silica. Silica is like a gliding agent. It's also a filler, and it's also a texture enhancer. Same as dimethicone. If you look at the Modern Renaissance palette, you've got multitude of different silicones. You've got dimethicone, you've got, where did it go? I can never say this. Polymethylsilsisqualoxane, that is a filler. You've also got silica in there, which is also a filler. You've got a cross polymer. You've got cyclopentasiloxane. You have got polysilicone 11, which is an artificial silicone. There's a lot of gliding agents in this palette. Subculture. Talc. A polymer. Zinc stearate. Now there is dimethicone and silicone in this palette, but it is not at the very front half of the ingredients list. Now, if you're not familiar with how ingredients lists work, essentially it starts, the very first item on the ingredients list has to be between 85 and 95% of the content of the item. So if you look at an ingredients list, you'll see that the first ingredient is talc, because that is what this is primarily made of. So in order from greatest to least, you've got your talc, you've got your it's a polymer of some kind. You've also got zinc stearate, which is going to act as a mild binding agent. You've also got your caprol glycol, which acts as a preservative. You've got dimethicone, which is the third last ingredient on the list, ethylhexyl glycerin, which also acts as a preservative. Anything with ethyl in it is ethylated. You've also got silica, which is the last ingredient on the list. So this palette is primarily made of talc and very, very few binding agents. To say that these are sister palettes was a very big mistake on Anastasia's part. Why? Because they're nothing alike. They work well together, absolutely. You can make some really nice color combinations, but to say that they specifically were sister palettes, I think was very not a good direction for Anastasia to go into. Subculture is a pressed pigment. If you think about pure loose pigments, like use MAC, for example, or Star Crush Minerals, they are pigments. Oftentimes they're loose, because if you try and smush them together, you have subculture. They're very loose, they're very kind of powdery, they explode everywhere, they stain everything. Modern Renaissance, if you took all the fillers and all of the gliding agents out of it, would be exactly like Subculture. So Modern Renaissance is full of all these beautiful, soft, gliding agents. Now, this is the struggle with making makeup. There's a balance between the pigment and the filler. The filler is what allows the pigment to be dispersed in a soft, blendable manner. Eyeshadows, for example, like Natasha Denona. Now, Natasha Denona's palettes are talc-based, but they're also very buttery. Giving the shadow that soft, buttery feel is going to be your dimethicones, your ethylhexyl glycerins, your capryl glycols, which also act as preservatives. It's your silica, it's your silicone, it's your cyclopentasiloxane. Without those ingredients, your pigments are going to cling. Pigments are not naturally soft and blendable. Pigments are strong. That's why you really only need a teeny, 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 tiny piece of pigment and a lot more filler. Just basically judging by the ingredients on here, it's primarily filler in Modern Renaissance. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think Anastasia's intentions for Subculture were good. Because if you think about it this way, Modern Renaissance swatches okay, but it applies a lot better than it swatches because it blends, and then once you warm the product and you really work it into your skin, it works really, really well. Subculture is the opposite. It finger swatches like boom, because that's what people want to see. They want to see that pigment when they swatch it on their skin. But then when you go to work it into your eyes, this palette versus this palette, they are not, you can't use them the same way. You have to use completely different techniques when you apply Subculture versus when you apply Modern Renaissance. So think of it this way. Think of Subculture not as an eyeshadow palette, but a pressed pigment. Think of Modern Renaissance as a blendable eyeshadow. I think if people adjust their expectations on this palette, they're not going to have a lot of difficulty working with it. And I think that if you adjust your technique and really think about the fact that you're using a pressed pigment versus a pressed eyeshadow, I think people's expectations would have been a lot more reasonable. Anyways, that's that. So the next point that I want to get at is this batch code. So anyways, I was reading KJ Bennett's Facebook post, or I believe it was an Instagram post. I think it was both. I think he cross posts. Anyways, and he was talking about the batch code thing. Now, when I make skincare, it's very, very similar. And there's a difference between manufacturing batch codes. So if you think about it, to manufacture a product, you have to do two things. You need to create your, basically what's going into your packaging, and you have to have the component. So I'll give you an example. This is a bottle, an empty component bottle for my skincare brand. Now, this is just a prototype. There's nothing in this, but this batch, which is F63 from the manufacturer, and the batch of raw ingredient that goes into this bottle that I make are two completely different batches. You take those two batches, you put them together, the manufacturing process creates a new batch number, which is what you see right in your palette there. So mine is P7F21. Everybody has different batch codes. I'm not going to go into that. My batch code is a good batch code. Your batch code is a bad batch code, because fuck that. It doesn't mean anything. Just because you have P7F batch code and somebody has an E72 batch code, that's just the batch code of it being manufactured into a palette. That's not the actual manufacturing of the physical pigment itself that's being put into the palette. What this batch code has to do with is it has to do with the creation of the palette as a whole. Anastasia's manufacturer of her eyeshadows could have made these pigments months in advance. This palette itself was made in a different factory as the pigments were made. The pigments are stored in a big vat and then they're divided up. Just because you have a different batch code, manufacturing batch code, does not mean that the pigments came from a completely different batch. They probably came from the same vat. They probably had a vat of Axis, for example, and they are using this batch of Axis, and they're pressing it into the first 500,000 palettes. We don't know. They're good for tracking your specific product. They're good at determining when the product itself was put together and was made as a whole. But as far as the raw ingredients, for all we know, they could have been sitting for months. They could be months older than the palettes are. The palettes itself, the component itself, could be way older than the pigment. We don't know. That's why batch codes are unreliable for this sort of thing. But that's why some people with the same batch code are not having any problems. Okay, so my next point is the fallout and the softness. What you need to understand is you need to adjust your technique, and when I mean adjust your technique, I'll show you in a minute. You need to adjust your technique using Subculture versus using an eyeshadow. So for my eyes today, I used Axis in the crease, I used Rowdy over the lid, I used Mercury as my kind of base color, and then I used Dawn as my transition shade. When you apply these eyeshadows, you cannot do this. You can't do the windshield wiper. You cannot do that. It will explode all over your face. You will make a mess. It doesn't work. Now the technique that I use, and I'm going to show you using, this is the exact brush. This is my Furless Pro 27E. It's the cruelty-free dupe for a Mac 217. This is the exact brush that I used in my crease. Now, let me see if I can zoom in a wee bit. The pigment is there. I primed my eyes, I did everything normally, but I used a technique, actually, that I learned back when I worked for a makeup brand called directional blending. This is, I think, the most important technique to consider when using pigments. I'm going to show you. Now, dipping into Axis, once, one time, tap off the excess. I'm trying to think of how I can show you. You know what? I'm actually going to show you on my eye. So I'm just going to take my mirror here. Directional blending is this. You apply, and then you blend in the direction that you want the product to go. No swirlies, no windshield wipers. Very soft movements. You see how that gradually moves the pigment across the eye? But do you see the fallout? There's no fallout. I have no fallout on my eyes because I'm gradually moving the pigment instead of spreading it. You can't smear the pigment. You have to kind of baby the pigment. You have to embrace the pigment, and you have to kind of move it. If you want to blend, then you can go back in with a blending brush, but again, think about your directional blending. Think about, you can go a little bit back and forth, but primarily, you want to blend gently in the direction that you want to go. Now, it's not very easy to see because I already have a crap ton of eyeshadow all over my eyes. But the pigment stays where you put it, and it's gently moved to the area that you want it to go. With Modern Renaissance, you can swirl, you can move. Because the formula has that forgiveness, this palette has no forgiveness. You have to be very, very, very careful of where you place every single color. If you don't place the color in the proper place, I hate to say it, but you're kind of screwed. So anyways, so that's the technique that I use. And in terms of applying color to the lid, I will show you using the color Rowdy, which is the dark purple that I have on my lid right now. And I will show you just pressing into the palette like so, tapping off the excess. I have a dog hair on my eyeshadow brush. Ah! Hang on. See how Can you hear me? Tap on the excess. Goodbye. And you just want to press. You want to press and glide in the direction that you want to go. And then to blend, what I did actually was I took a little bit of Axis, again, very, very tiny, tiny, tiny amount, and then did my directional blending. Just very soft. Now I'm doing it exaggerated, I'm really slowing it down for you guys to see it, but if I did it at normal speed, it would look something like this. Going into my palette, tapping off my excess, patting onto the eye, and then taking Axis, tapping off the excess, I feel like Anastasia Beverly Hills had really, really good intentions in mind when they brought this palette out. They really, truly did. The intentions were good. The frustrating thing is that I feel like they didn't educate people about the differences of the palette. The color combinations, like the two palettes are complementary to each other, which is I think more what they were referring to in terms of the sister palette. But in terms of formula, they are nothing alike. Are they cheaper? Is the Subculture palette cheaper because it has less filler? No, absolutely not. Is it cheaper because it has a talc base versus a mica base? Absolutely not. It has nothing to do with that. If you think that that's the case, then that's fine. You're entitled to your own opinion. But an established brand such as Anastasia Beverly Hills, based on the quality of the rest of their products in their product line, I sincerely doubt they're going to come out with a shitty eyeshadow formula. Because you see what happens? Do you see what happens with this? A simple miscommunication about how to use this palette? People are going crazy. So, I honestly don't think they would cheapen their palettes out on purpose. I really truly think that Norvina is trying to make good quality palettes. And if you think that that makes me a suck up for saying that, then fine. Good for you. That's good for you. Right, so that's all I wanted to touch on with the palette. I hope that this review was helpful. I'm going to try and make it as cohesive as I can with some editing and whatnot. But yeah, this is a long video, and if you stay till the end, thank you very much for listening to my perspective. Thank you very much for listening to what I have to say. Every single YouTube video that I have watched, that I have gathered information from, as well as different sources of my own, I will list them in the drop box down below. That way you can peruse them for yourself, and you can be an educated consumer and create an opinion for yourself. Please don't hate on the YouTubers that like this palette. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.